In 1893, a trial in the District of Columbia pitted a young woman against a powerful United States congressman. The salacious allegations captivated the nation and went to the very heart of the power structures of the Gilded Age. The Breckinridge-Pollard affair is little remembered today, but at the time it was, as one contemporary account explained, the most noted breach of promise suit in the history of court records, and it deserves to be remembered. On August 13, 1893, 26-year-old Madeline Pollard filed a breach of promise suit in the Supreme Court of the District of Columbia. In her filing, she wrote, "She sues the defendant, William P. Breckenridge, for that whereas heretofore, on the 17th of May, 1893, in consideration that the plaintiff being unmarried, at the request of the defendant, had then undertaken and promised the defendant to marry him, and that him the defendant undertook and promised the plaintiff to marry her. Yet he disregarded his promise." One of the lurid and sensational forms of American court activity, Professor Robert C. Brown of the Indiana University School of Law explained in a 1929 edition of the University of Pennsylvania Law Review, is the suit known technically as a suit for the breach of contract to marry, but more popularly by the simple designation of a breach of promise suit. All suits for breach of contract are technically for the breach of promise, but when the term breach of promise suit is used, neither lawyer nor layman has any difficulty in understanding what is meant. Journalist Patricia Miller told Smithsonian Magazine in 2018 that such suits were not uncommon. They recognized that marriage was women's primary career in those days, and that there was a real financial hardship if you had a kind of aged out of the desirable marriage age. But this particular suit was uncommon for a number of reasons. First, the damages requested were exceedingly large, $50,000, the equivalent of more than $1 million today. Second, the suit was filed against a powerful individual. William Breckenridge was an influential 5-term congressman from Kentucky. 30 years Pollard's senior, Breckenridge was known as a silver-tongued gentleman. The Biographical Directory of the United States Congress writes that after being admitted to the bar in 1857, Breckenridge had enlisted in the Confederate Army during the U.S. Civil War, where, as colonel of the 9th Kentucky Cavalry, he was in command of the Kentucky Cavalry designated to act as bodyguard for President Jefferson Davis and the members of his cabinet at the close of the Civil War. In 1891, the Washington Post opined that one of the most interesting gentlemen upon the floor of the House is the Honorable W.C.P. Breckenridge of Kentucky. Mr. Breckenridge has a florid complexion and silver hair and beard. His eyes are blue and his manner cheerful and impressive. He is one of the true orators of the House. He speaks fluidly and incisively and always commands attention. Mr. Breckenridge is one of the best lawyers in Kentucky. He is a lawyer among lawyers. His legal brothers consult him in regard to their cases, as though they were clients. In fact, in 1883, the well-connected cousin of former Vice President John C. Breckenridge was almost certainly thinking of higher office. Encyclopedia.com explains that in 1893, it seemed that William Campbell Preston Breckenridge of Kentucky was destined for great things. The 5-term Democratic congressman's grandfather was an attorney general. His cousin was a vice president, and several other relatives were senators, representatives, and governors. There was talk of higher office, and the congressman dreamed of the White House. Pollard, on the other hand, the Washington, D.C. history site Boundary Stones explains, was not born into high society. She grew up in rural Kentucky, where her father died early, ending her schooling and leaving her mother with 6 children and no means to earn a living. An 1893 edition of the Boston Globe wrote that she was not prepossessing in her features, but there was an indefinable attractiveness about her face. She was a brunette of slender build, but not tall. Her manners were charming. Not only was she a woman of modest birth and means, challenging one of the nation's most powerful men, but she was not the typical plaintiff in a breach of promise case. Miller explains, these suits were designed to protect the reputation of respectable women. And what was revolutionary was that Pollard admitted that she was a fallen woman. She had been Breckenridge's longtime mistress. When his wife died, he did not marry her, as he had promised. But her position made the suit even more important to her future. Miller told Smithsonian, in those days, if a woman was fallen, she was a social pariah. She couldn't get a respectable job or live in a respectable home, and she certainly could never make a respectable marriage. Breckenridge's breach of promise essentially left Pollard destitute and without prospects. While her suit instantly garnered attention, the difficulty she faced was made clear in Breckenridge's first response. printed in the August 13th, 1893 edition of the New York Times. I can only say at this time that I hope my friends will believe that these charges are the result of vindictiveness, vexation, and perhaps of intention to blackmail, and ask that they suspend judgment until a full hearing shall have shown all that was in them. In fact, her allegations were scandalous. The New York Times reported that she claimed to have first met the congressman in April of 1884, when she was just 17 years old and a student at Wesleyan Female Seminary. The two, she claimed, had met on a train traveling to Frankfort, Kentucky, where she had been called on account of the grave illness of her sister. She said that the congressman made her acquaintance on the plea of knowing her family, and that she was flattered by his attentions, knowing who he was and regarding him as a very prominent man, and that he subsequently, by wiles and artifices and protestations of affection, subsequently took advantage of her youth and inexperience. The entire idea was scandalous. Breckenridge at the time was a prominent Kentucky lawyer and law professor, 47 years old and married. His daughter Nisba was a year older than Pollard. But the allegations went on. Not only had the two had an affair, she claimed, but it had continued for nearly a decade. The Times wrote, "The birth of 2 children who died and the premature birth of a 3rd child are alleged to be the result of this intimacy." Historian Sandy Levins writes on the website Wednesday's Woman, Pollard also became pregnant twice during that period. Both times the Colonel sent her to lying-in homes, charities that took in unwed mothers to keep them out of the public eye. And both times Pollard gave her babies up to what were known as infant asylums, where both children died. She agreed to relinquish them when Breckenridge insisted that he couldn't risk having their paternity traced to him. Pollard claimed that during the affair the congressman insisted that he would marry her when he could. Levins writes that Breckenridge had always assured Pollard that he would marry her if only he were free to do so. Following the death of his second wife in 1892, Breckenridge proposed they marry, but only after a suitable period of mourning. Their engagement was announced in the New York Times on June 24th, 1893. However, the Times writes, from time to time, the plaintiff alleges, the date was postponed until on July 18th, she alleges, Mr. Breckenridge wrongfully and injuriously married another woman, Miss Louisa Wing. Wing was a wealthy widow and Breckenridge's distant cousin. The Times wrote, the announcement of her engagement to Mr. Breckenridge and the subsequent breaking of that engagement and Mr. Breckenridge's marriage created sensation in the capital. In his response, Breckenridge denied having made any promise to Pollard. He gave a different account of their meeting. Rather than him introducing himself, his account said that he was accosted by the young woman, whom he described as between 20 and 22 years of age, rather than 17. He denied that he, by wiles and artifices and protestations of affections, or by any other means, attempted to take advantage of the youth and inexperience of the plaintiff, and denied that the plaintiff was at any time pregnant by the defendant. Most directly, his response denies that there was at any time any contract, agreement, or understanding of marriage between the plaintiff and the defendant, and that the plaintiff knew during her entire acquaintance with the defendant that this was impossible. Breckenridge's allies moved quickly to discredit Pollard. An August 15th edition of the Philadelphia Inquirer reported that Breckenridge's friends here unite in saying that the suit filed against him by Miss Madeline Pollard is the result of spite. All of them believe Mr. Breckenridge innocent of the charges made by the woman. One close friend of Mr. Breckenridge, a Confederate veteran, said tonight that he believes that Miss Pollard to be an adventuress. The Alexandria, Virginia Gazette wrote that when visited by a reporter, Pollard said, I am not by any means all the sort of a woman have been described. When I go on the stand, I think that many will change their views about me and my position in this whole affair. Anyone can see by the character of the lawyers who have undertaken my case that I have a good case. They would not have taken it if it had not been such. The Lexington, Kentucky Leader seemed to agree regarding her attorneys. Miss Pollard's attorneys, Judge Jerry M. Wilson and Honorable Caldwin Carlisle, stand at the very head of the Washington bar, and would not touch a suit of this character without satisfying themselves of the truth of at least such portion of Miss Pollard's astounding narrative as could be verified. Breckenridge had reason to be concerned that his reputation alone would not save him. The Owensboro, Kentucky Messenger opined, this is a time for plain speaking, and there is no use disguising the fact that the people of Lexington are disgusted with the sentimental twaddle that we've heard for the few days past, of standing by the colonel in his misfortune, etc., etc. There is nothing in the nature of misfortune about the scandal, as we understand the word. Levins says of the 1894 trial, the Madeline Pollard case was tried in the nation's capital in a trial lasting 28 days. Lines formed outside the courtroom. Upholding the tightly laced Victorian morals of the day, women were barred from the courtroom lest they hear the lurid testimony. But for more than a month, people all across America couldn't get enough of the salacious details. Carlyle, in his opening statement, said, "She does not come here saying that she is devoid of fault or blame, but that there is the promise of marriage and its breach, the issue in this case." At the trial, Mrs. Julia Blackburn, widow of former Kentucky Governor Luke Blackburn, testified that Colonel Breckenridge had brought Pollard to her house and said, "I have brought this young woman to ask for her your kind care and protection, for I expect that in the future she will be a great deal to me. As soon as sufficient time after the death of my wife has elapsed, I intend to marry her." Major William G. Moore, the District of Columbia Chief of Police, recounted a bizarre tale of how Breckenridge had taken Pollard into the police department, stating that his life was threatened and that he wanted protection. Miss Pollard had drawn from her bosom a pistol, which she said unless Colonel Breckenridge married her, she would use on him and herself. But on another visit, the major testified that Colonel Breckenridge sat on the sofa in his office side by side with Miss Pollard, her hand clasped in his, and said that she was pregnant by him, was going to New York to prepare for the event, and that after that, they were to be married. Despite his denials, there was evidence linking him to her pregnancies. A Dr. E. Tabor Johnson testified that he had attended Pollard during her miscarriage in May of 1893 and provided letters and telegrams sent by the colonel in regards to sanitation, cost, comfort, etc., such as to seemingly connect the defendant with the matter. Likewise, a Dr. Mary Parsons testified that Breckenridge had paid the bill for professional services when Pollard had given birth in February of 1888. Pollard broke down as the doctor testified that the child had gone to an asylum and had died the following April. The trial was as sensational as it promised to be. At one point, the tension between the opposing attorneys almost resulted in fisticuffs, and they had to be broken up by a bailiff. In his closing argument, Wilson argued, "There's one thing I expect to show, and if I show it, I will be satisfied. It is that this woman, friendless, alone, barred out of society, that this woman's condition is traceable to the crime of that man. This is the simplest case in the world, and if you get out of your head all the clamoring and shouting of the defendant's counsel, you will see how simple it is." Breckenridge's lawyer simply tried to discredit Pollard as a self-acknowledged prostitute. The jury only required an hour-and-a-half deliberation before finding in favor of Pollard and assessing damages of $15,000. Breckenridge's political career was destroyed. He lost re-election and never again served in public office. The Lafayette, Indiana Sunday Times opined that he went back to the constituency that he had disgraced and asked for a restoration of confidence that he had deliberately forfeited. He died in 1904 following complications from a stroke. Levins described him at the time as a mentally, physically, and financially broken man. However, he reportedly never paid any of the $15,000 judgment to Pollard. Pollard, for her part, went to Europe, became friends with a wealthy Irish widow, and the two of them traveled around Europe while she pursued her writing career. She died in December of 1945. The case was salacious by the standards of the time, but it also changed some of those standards. Breckenridge was derided as a lust fiend, while Pollard was exonerated despite being a fallen woman. The jury had repudiated the sexual double standards of the 19th century and the Gilded Age. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.